this is, as you know, and you've written as well, is the first most widely covered event in human history. Quite frankly, it's the first time in all of human history that you can genuinely say that mankind has coordinated a single act, which is to say, more or less, to lockdown. And a part of that includes, obviously, the total freeze on global migration. Right? No one is crossing borders right now. So sitting at home is actually a fascinating, time in which to reflect on what might come next. And there are certain things that, as I was sitting and thinking about it, that are really going to accelerate trends that were underway prior to the pandemic. So it wasn't all that difficult, despite all the uncertainty that we do. We have to obviously have a great deal of humility in terms of what's going to happen in the future. But we do know that shocks have aftershocks, earthquakes have aftershocks. It goes without saying. So what are the next ones? Now, there's a couple of things. The first is the trends that were already underway that will accelerate. And these are what you would call secular trends. They are these irrevocable, almost, processes. And the trends around the pandemic will simply elevate them. One is this regionalism, right? Regionalization is the new globalization, and we've almost chosen that as our point of departure. It's almost hard to disagree at this point. The evidence is so incredibly overwhelming. Just think about the US-China trade war and that decoupling. The US trades much more with Canada than it does with China. The US trades much more with Mexico than it does with China. China, for its part, trades more with Southeast Asia than it does with the United States. And Europe, of course, has 70% of its trade internal. So there's absolutely no question that we live in a world that is more regional than it is global. There is a North American system. It has its own logic, its own driving forces, its own, obviously, cultural variables and parameters. Same thing for Europe. And Asia being, of course, the largest region by far, the most people by far, the largest number of civilizations by far, has its own internal dynamics. And that is where the world already was going. And with everyone pulling back, drawing back into their shells, so to speak, and obviously our inability to even conceive of transcontinental travel anytime soon, we're going to have a hard time one region really shaping the other decisively. Rather, each region is going to shape itself. So that's an example of one of these things you can simply just predict with great confidence is going to be the same moving forward. We can talk about lots of the aftershocks, obviously. Some of the ones, as you know, relate to countries that you and I have both traveled in, studied, written about. The countries of the Near East, the countries really in the underbelly of Eurasia, the North African countries, the petrostates. These places are in for a very, very, very rough ride. Now, again, just a quick point, that began in 2014, right? Oil prices began to crash in 2014. They've utterly cratered now. How can one possibly craft a rosy scenario for those countries? So it's not a difficult prediction to make that negative oil prices are going to create, significant aftershocks for those economies and societies as well.
You said regionalization is the new globalization. Parag, do you really think globalization can go away? I mean, I know you've written about the butterfly effect, and the truth is that regardless of how the coronavirus actually reached man, whether it was from a laboratory or whether it was a wet market or everything in between, the fact is that small incident in Wuhan has now ensured that people across the world cannot leave their homes. People have changed the way they work. People have changed the way they look at their futures and or concerns about their health and all the rest of that. So do you really think globalization is going away and it'll give way to these small worlds instead?
No, not at all. And, I think the critical thing, and I'm glad you raised the question, is that we balance both these ideas at the same time. By volume or density of interactions, whether it's human migration, whether it's trade in goods and other factors, regionalism is voluminously more significant at the moment than those transcontinental forces. Even if you never had a pandemic, let's remember that even global energy markets, which are a very important barometer of globalization, have been receding. We don't really need to send oil tankers all over the world anyway, because so many regions are moving towards alternative and renewable energy sources. China's taken a big lead in that. India is pushing in that direction. Europe has grid parity. North America is itself already now the largest oil and gas producer, doesn't need to import anything. So we were deglobalizing in certain critical areas of the world economy. That doesn't mean that we don't have this global connectivity. And I champion that connectivity probably as much as anyone, alive. So I still believe it's there. Globalization is the extent to which you use that connectivity at any given time. We have airports, we have airlines, no one's using them right now. Do we have universal aviation connectivity? Absolutely. Are we using it? Zilch, right? So globalization is just a very constantly fluctuating set of metrics. That's all.
Okay, so
the butterfly effect operates through connectivity. Now, China can unleash a pandemic on the planet Earth, collapse the global economy, and have these cataclysmically negative ripple effects on the world. And still, corporate America is saying, we're still going to make in China. Because you have to make where you sell. China is a large market. Every iPhone that Apple will sell in China will be made in China. General Motors has opened new automobile plants in China. Tesla has opened up a big gigafactory and showrooms in China. Intel, Qualcomm, the semiconductor manufacturers, everything in China. They will not pull out of China. But will they also start to manufacture in India? You bet. Vietnam, absolutely. Make where you sell, make for that market. And even if it was technologically possible to have robots in Texas make all the iPhones that Apple sells in any given year for the whole planet, they would not be able to do it simply because if you want to sell those in China, and if you want to sell them in India, because India is absolutely practicing the same kind, make in India, hashtag make in India. The whole campaign is Chinese-style industrial policy in a number of ways. And I'm not criticizing it. Every country gets ahead through import substitution and by demanding that foreign investors make where you sell. So even if you could make it super cheap, cheap energy, cheap robotic labor in America, it's not going to cross the Chinese border. So how are you going to make your global revenue? Western multinationals get 40 to 60% of their global revenue from outside the United States, outside of Europe. How are they going to get it? So you cannot sacrifice that make where you sell principle. And that's where the world is going, which is, again, globalization, right? It's just in a different form. It is morphing and mutating all the time.
And simultaneously with the pandemic of COVID-19, there has been another kind of pandemic, a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation about the pandemic online. And in some ways, the online viruses, the conspiracy theories, for example, are even more contagious than the virus itself and are adding to the confusion and I think to the errors of judgment that people are making.
Well, there's so many themes to pick out from that, but I think the one that strikes me the most as you're talking is the question of authority and elites. And your anecdote about Davos really captures something critically important, which is that the global elite inhabit an echo chamber which is remarkably oblivious to all sorts of things. For example, I myself was at a lunch at the Kennedy School here at Harvard the very day that Harvard had announced that it was sending undergraduates home to prevent a serious outbreak here on campus. And all kinds of experts of the sort who doubtless graced the halls of Davos were confidently claiming that this was a massive overreaction and that by the end of the year we would see that there were way fewer deaths from this new virus than there would be from the flu. And from this I take a couple of points. One is that we should never trust policymakers who spend more time talking to each other than they do to real people. And the second point is that real people have every reason, therefore, to mistrust the policymakers, and that this is exactly what fosters the spread of misinformation. What I see happening in this pandemic, and as one sees in many kinds of crises, wars, I think, being rather similar in part, or economic catastrophes, is that trends that had already been going on get amplified and deepened. And so the mistrust in authority and in what we could call traditional makers of authority, traditional disseminators of information, has been building for a very long time. And what we're seeing now is the complete collapse of those institutions and the faith in them. How does that resonate with you, and does that fit with earlier historical episodes?
I think that's quite right. I mean, part of what happens when a new pathogen that is both contagious and deadly arises is that trust breaks down at the most fundamental level, in that you can't be quite sure if your neighbor or the person sitting next to you on the plane has the virus, and they can't be sure if you have it, especially if it's a virus like SARS-CoV-2, which can be carried without any symptoms by a really significant number of people who get it. So I think there's a sort of breakdown in the most fundamental kind of trust, and we can see that in earlier plagues, and I think the word's appropriate. You can see, for example, great crises that followed 1918-19, when the countries that were most affected by that particular pandemic saw real and lasting damage to social capital, to trust. But your question's really about the trust we should have in authority. And I think it's not surprising that that has taken a succession of blows, because actually the authorities have not been straight with the people from the get-go. The Chinese authorities in Wuhan, and then at the national level, sought to cover up what was happening and to hush up the doctors who were sounding the alarm in December, and conceivably also in November. We still don't really know what happened in Wuhan, except that there was a cover-up. The World Health Organization was in some measure complicit in that, because it was so keen to ingratiate itself with Beijing. And as a result, there was false information coming from the highest level, from the agency responsible for international pandemic preparedness and disease control. And it gets worse from there on. Not only, as everybody knows, did Donald Trump misunderstand the problem and go through a phase of denying altogether that there was a problem, but I think even worse, when he showed signs of concern in late January and called for a ban on Chinese passengers coming into the US, the entire liberal media erupted in a chorus of indignation, accusing him of racism. And actually, the number of articles that appeared in liberal publications making the argument you just alluded to, oh, it's no more serious than the seasonal flu, I lost count of. There were so many, mostly written by people wholly ignorant of the subject. Then you add another problem into the mix, the epidemiologists. Now, we're frequently told, it's sort of grown out of the Greta Thunberg movement, to trust the science, trust the science. But actually, the science of epidemiology is quite unscientific in some ways. And the really influential model that my near namesake, Neil Ferguson, was responsible for, the Imperial College model. By the way, I'm not him, just in case anybody's wondering. He spells his name Neil, and he's based in London. But his model, which led the British and American governments to panic in mid-March and start authorizing major economic lockdowns, turned out to be entirely a gimcrack piece of modeling that no serious data scientist could believe when they saw it. So I think there's just been multiple failures from the WHO down to Imperial College's epidemiologists, and it's left this humble historian rather staggered. I continue to be staggered at the ways in which people in public office misjudge the problem. A good example of this was the crazy decision by numerous states to shut down parks and beaches. This happened in California, where I'm normally based. You can't really get COVID-19 on a beach or in a park. In fact, it's better for people to be outdoors in fresh air and sunlight. But no, for weeks, those places were closed, and you had surreal episodes like the Californian police arresting a guy who was paddleboarding. The idea that there was anybody remotely endangered by this man paddleboarding was preposterous. So there's just been any amount of idiocy from the WHO right down to national, state, and municipal governments. And I don't blame people for being disillusioned and skeptical about what they're then told. One last point, masks. We were assured that we should not wear masks, that in fact there was no point in wearing them. This was a lie, because there weren't enough masks to provide health workers with them. And it's not surprising that when the science made it clear that masks were absolutely crucial and should be worn in any crowded setting, that people were indignant because they had been lied to before on that subject. The big story has been Black Lives Matter. Now, as somebody who's married to an African woman with 2 boys of mixed race, I take this issue very, very seriously indeed. And there is ample evidence that, for example, the police are much more likely to use physical force when they're dealing with African American suspects. That this is clear. What's not true is the claim that they disproportionately use lethal violence against African Americans. That's not right, and it's problematic because it's the central claim of Black Lives Matter, and it's just not compatible with the data which show that the police are just as likely, perhaps even slightly more likely, to use lethal force against white suspects. Don't take it from me. I mean, take it from African American scholars like Roland Fryer and Coleman Hughes who've shown this. At any event, I think the really important point here is that Black Lives Matter has erupted as a kind of huge distraction from the central problem the United States faces, which is COVID-19. There is a second wave of infection and illness now in a majority of states, including some very important states like Texas, for example, and Arizona. And when I look at the American South and the American West, including California, I see a country that has not successfully contained this pandemic and which is on course to have probably another 100,000 deaths between now and the end of the year, leaving out of account the possibility of another wave when schools go back in the late summer. And that's really, to me, the big issue right now that we should focus on. Ultimately, there is going to be a time to discuss ways in which to reform the police, though defunding them doesn't seem like the obvious way. But right now, the United States has a very clear and present problem, which is a pandemic. And to have conversations about police violence in the midst of a pandemic, that does seem to me a little bit like a huge collective aberration, a kind of distraction, which, by the way, probably benefits Donald Trump politically. So from the point of view of the left, it looks to me like a grave error. He was much more vulnerable to the critique that he'd screwed up the pandemic than to this critique, which I think takes him back to the familiar territory of the culture war, where he's a pretty experienced combatant. And the left tends to underestimate the extent to which appeals to law and order can still mobilize a significant proportion of independent as well as Republican voters.
I agree completely that that Trump is on stronger terrain when it comes to a culture war, and that the pandemic has not been contained in the United States. These are indisputable points. I think, however, what was entirely missing from your discussion just now is something of which, of course, you are completely aware, namely that the virus has proved more fatal in minority communities, underprivileged minority communities in the United States, as it has in the UK. The correlation of poverty with heightened exposure and mortality from disease is a correlation that we can trace, of course, historically. In the 19th century, for example, it was a common, policymakers' diagnosis that the poor were more prone to disease because of who they were and because of their habits, and therefore we needed to fix their habits and improve them so that they wouldn't get disease. I think it is important that we not fall into the same kind of blaming the victim rhetoric now, and rather than see Black Lives Matter as a distraction, I would posit that what it is the expression of the extremely long-standing, real, as it were, epidemic in the United States, which is that poor African Americans, Latinx populations have been, essentially placed in dangerous situations to their health and safety for an incredibly long time. The pandemic has made everybody see that, and that while perhaps reforming policing is only one piece of a much larger problem, I would suggest that the big problem in the United States is to deal with this radical social injustice and inequality in the American population.
It's been, for all of us, an absolutely extraordinary time. We've just put the 10th issue of The Economist out, which we've produced completely remotely. All of our films, all of our podcasts, everything that we do is being done by my colleagues, often in quite interesting conditions, colleagues with young children making podcasts by hiding in their cupboards so that their children don't disturb them. But it has been, we are very lucky. We can do our jobs remotely. And it has been actually striking how relatively easily, we have shifted to being fully remote. We use, I'm sure like you, we use Zoom as we are doing now, we use Slack, we use Google Hangout, we use all manner of technologies. But actually, I've been very struck looking back how the technical side of producing the newspaper has actually shifted relatively easily to being completely remote. And at the same time, we are living through this extraordinary, tragic, but just sort of devastating and almost incomprehensible in its scale pandemic. And so it's the most extraordinary experience of our lifetime. And to be able to be a journalist trying to make sense of this, trying to explain to our readers, trying to help understand not only where things are and what's happening now, but as you say, where things are going, is just sort of an extraordinary responsibility, really, and privilege. So we have all been, my colleagues have been amazing and working unbelievably hard. And I hope, producing some fantastic journalism that has actually helped people really make sense of this. I don't think we will go back to anything like the world we had before. And the reason is severalfold. Firstly, that until we have a vaccine widely available and widely administered, the disease is still here and with us, and the risks are still here. And so there will still be the need for some social distancing. So many industries, many activities, many parts of the economy that depend on people being in close proximity to one another will have to either not operate at all, or if they do operate in a very different way. And that is, the hospitality industry, crowded restaurants, crowded bars, outdoor mass entertainment, the tourism industry, a huge global industry, 7% of global exports. But right now, almost every country still has restrictions on travel. So there will be sectors for whom, even with a partial unwinding of the lockdown, we're not going to go back to anything that we had before. And that means that the economy as a whole will need to reconfigure. There will be some sectors, some industries that will do much better. I mean, e-commerce has taken a huge step forward because of the pandemic. And we will need to reallocate resources from sectors that will not return to sectors that are growing. And that reallocation, I think we simply haven't started yet. And that's going to take a fairly long period of time. And we wrote about this a few weeks ago. We put it on our cover and we called it the 90% economy, because it's really an economy where overall things return, but they don't go back to where they were. And some sectors are the 50% economy, some are the 100% economy, but overall it is an economy that is not what it was. And we can talk about it, but that has very big impacts, I think, for the pace of innovation. It has very big impact in inequality. It has very big impacts for huge trends that have identified our world economy. So the sort of short answer is, you're completely right. The post-COVID economy is not the same as the pre-COVID economy.
I think a lot of people are looking around the world right now and saying, well, it appears everybody is reopening. People are trying to work out how to reopen, but the only country that seems to be, as you say, getting at least close to 90% is mainland China. And, we can talk about whether that's irritating under the circumstances, but definitely they worked a little. They got at it earlier, and now it appears that they're close to reopening, or they're close to, as you say, 90%. Now, the question that we have here is that, are we talking about a further strengthening of their broad argument that they've been taking to many parts of the emerging world in particular, that in dealing with crises like this, in dealing with, the problems of development, our management of the economy, the way that we control the financial system, is a better way than what you've been taught so far?
Well, that's certainly, or at least a form of that, is clearly what they are trying to do. I mean, there's been an absolute, as you know, sort of huge propaganda effort by the Chinese, both to, deflect attention from the fact that they did cover up the virus at the beginning and, therefore do bear some culpability for this. And secondly, to focus on the great generosity of the Chinese people in helping people around the world. And thirdly, showing off the contrast between, China's handling and, in their view, particularly the United States handling, which is, I think in China's telling would show how, abjectly useless a democracy is. I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but that's sort of what I think there is a sense of national pride and sort of very aggressive nationalism right now in China. But I think if you unpack that, I'm I'm not sure. I think the heavy-handedness of some of that Chinese state-driven approach has actually backfired. I mean, certainly in Africa, there's been some very sort of heavy-handed propaganda, and then the treatment of African nationals within China, really backfired on them. Secondly, I think if that was genuine, and if there was a genuine desire to sort of play a global leadership role, and my goodness, there's a vacuum of global leadership right now. I mean, the United States really has been sort of missing in action in terms of its traditional global leadership role. I don't really see China stepping up to that in any way that, we would recognize as what one would hope for from a sort of responsible global leadership role. I mean, its behavior in what it's doing in Hong Kong in its own backyard, I'm sure we can get onto that. There isn't a sense in which China is stepping up either, frankly, in the handling of the pandemic broadly, but also in, longer term themes, whether it's climate change and so forth, although there is a huge option now. So I'm not as sure as I think at least the premise of your question suggests, that China's approach holds as much appeal as they would like it to. I don't think it's playing as much of a kind of responsible leadership role. That said, it's clearly showing up the weaknesses that are there from the vacuum of the US. And I think there's also a sense of China's growing clout. It matters. And so, as a customer of China, as an economy, as any economy that deals with China, it is there. It is increasingly aggressive in the way it behaves, and it's an important calculus for everybody to work out how they deal with China. I think
Exactly.
It was imprudent to rely on one supply chain largely with China and China alone. I think resilience comes from diversification. So ensure that you have diverse sources, not from autarkic producing everything at home.
Is this the end of the world as we know it?
No, I don't think so. I think it's something easy to believe, and we have a tendency to project from the situation we are in, which is vastly different from what we knew even a few weeks or months ago. We can't go out. The world GDP has fallen to the dumps. People are getting poorer everywhere, and it's easy to think, well, no, nothing is going to ever be the same. But I think history shows that the human race is amazingly resilient, and sort of manages to extract itself out of those disasters, starting from, say, the bubonic plague, which killed millions of people in 1600, and continuing with the 1919 flu epidemics and wars, and somehow find its way not so much different from what it was before. And I think there is a chance that it is going to happen again.
And do you think that that's necessarily a good thing? Do you think that that's what we want? Was the world that we had 3 months ago in good shape?
No, I don't think I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I suppose it depends what the alternative would have been. It's just a thing. I think we are less attuned to the possibility of maximum changes. Now, maybe we can discuss that in the course of this session. There have been other big events, like, for example, the World War, the Second World War, which has led to a dramatic rethinking of society, which had big dysfunctioning that were in part responsible for the war itself, and led to massive changes in the world, many for the good, like independence of former colonies, including India, of course. So maybe there would be a rethinking of some of the big challenges we are facing. But I don't know. I'm extremely bad at forecasting, but I also feel that there might be a desire to go back to what's familiar and what it is that we had.
I saw a study from yesterday of the poor migrants in Delhi, and the income loss is massive. They don't actually they're not yet mostly starving. I don't actually understand why, but Delhi is government was relatively proactive at the beginning to provide welfare. Food was provided. I think about 40% of them got something extra, etc. So there was some attempt. Maybe that's the reason. I don't know exactly what made it, but clearly what's important is that they sort of it was a catastrophe from their point of view. They felt completely battered by the whole thing, and that, I think, to undo that memory, we need to be thinking of schemes that will kind of at least reassure them that something, this won't happen again. So, for example, the government has talked about one nation, one ration card. I think it's a great idea. Do it, but now, like not in 3 months, not in 3 years, not in, even in 1 year. I think it has to be done now. And likewise, the idea of the universal ultra basic income that we talk about in our book, I think that's, if you do it, you have to do it now. What do you mean by ultra basic? So universal ultra basic income. What would be an adequate intervention at this point, you think? What's the, is it, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve money now, money in the future, assurance? I mean, all of these things. What do you have in mind in terms of if you say that this is what we should do? What is this?
I think ultra basic is to contrast it with basic, which is something that has been proposed worldwide and in many rich countries in particular, where the idea is really something that people could live on in a complete way, in a sense. And this would be a ton of money, budgets that would be very difficult to obtain, even in rich countries, let alone in poor countries. With ultra basic, I think what we need to target is survival, and survival now and forever. So ideally, we wouldn't just have the ultra basic today and then it would go away once the COVID crisis is gone. We would have the promise of ultra basic always there for you when you need it. So in the current crisis, what would be different is that you would really reach out to people and say, hey, there is this ultra basic income. And then when things are becoming a little bit better and when people are used to it, you could kind of ask them, this is what we are proposing in the book, we could ask them to kind of claim it so that people would only come and claim it when they need it. But what this would give is it would give people reassurance that no matter how bad things come, survival is a cell phone away, they have the possibility to do it. So in terms of levels, I think I'm going to turn the table and ask you the question, and then I want to ask you the last question since you asked me the first. But let's first, maybe you can say a few words about the type of budget that this would, per person, what is, because I know you've been working on the calculations, and so you have more expertise than me.
I think that 1,000 rupees per person per month would make a huge difference. That's probably too much. Maybe even 500 rupees. So it's like for a family of 5, 2,500 rupees. That's I think that makes a big difference. It will pay for all the emergency things essentially, other than if you need healthcare, expensive healthcare. But I think at this point, all of this, all of the at least COVID-related healthcare should be made free. There should be no charges anywhere, and I think the government should fit the bill if necessary in private hospitals. But we shouldn't be trying to design a new system for it. We should be just making it free and then paying for it if needed. But I think COVID-related should be treated. Since we are already trying to identify the cases, we should be in a good place to then say that, look, anybody whose case has been identified, we now provide him with healthcare. We don't have to worry about people abusing the system so much. So I think that there I would say, so even 2,000 rupees for a family every month, I think would make a big difference. Would provide an assurance that it's not as dire as it has been.
And do you think India can afford it, for example?
Yeah. At least for the next 6 months, they can afford it. I think India is going to actually face a massive demand shortfall. So I think pumping money into the hands of people might actually be the way to save the economy.
Thank you to our brilliant speakers in that episode. I'm so sorry I wasn't there to introduce everybody in. There was some technical problems. But thank you to Nobel laureates Abhijit P. Banerjee and Esther Duflo, the Miliband Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and Senior Faculty Fellow of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, Neil Ferguson, the Coolidge Professor of History at Harvard University, Maya Jasanoff, the Global Strategy Advisor, world traveler, and best-selling author Parag Khanna, diplomatic and national editor at The Hindu, Suhasini Haidar, editor-in-chief of The Economist, Zaini Minton Bidos, a senior fellow at the ORF, Mihir S. Sharma, and to our audiences for coming online and watching. Please do remember to log in on Friday, the 7th of August for another set of great sessions. Intern Paramita, the Wandering in Conversation with Shamim Black. What does it mean to forge your own path, and how far and wide can that path take you? In Intern Paramita's avant-garde adventure story, the reader is invited to blaze their own trail, to wander everywhere and nowhere, and through it all to question where and what is home. This will be at 7 p.m. IST, 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And the second session on Friday, the 7th of August, will be the making of modern Britain, Andrew Marr in conversation with Swapan Dasgupta. From Sylvia Plath to Elvis Costello, Frank Critchlow to Bob Geldof, Zaha Hadid to James Dyson, from David Attenborough to the Beatles. Each one of them has contributed in shaping the story of the modern United Kingdom. Andrew Marr is a leading British journalist and one of the most visible faces on BBC television, as well as the author of the recently released book, Elizabethans, How Modern Britain Was Forged. In this conversation with Swapan Dasgupta, Marr discusses the living history of modern Britain and reveals how artists, innovators, and activists define the new era and how Britain's past has shaped the 80s and the 90s. This will be at 8:30 p.m. IST, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. See you on Friday.